#human nerd was languishing in a tavern stool. Until an orc warrior commanded a seat, Marcus had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility. Not literal invisibility. He was a scholar, not a sorcerer, but the kind of social camouflage that kept trouble from finding you in a place like the Broken Flagon. Corner stool, quiet drink, eyes down. That was the system, that was survival, it worked beautifully. Until the night Sergeant Cora walked through the door. She wasn't subtle. 7 feet of green muscle wrapped in dented campaign armor, a decorated orc veteran who'd bled on 4 different front lines. And she was looking for a seat after a 16-hour patrol shift. The tavern was packed, every stool occupied, every face suddenly very interested in their cups. Except Marcus, who made the catastrophic mistake of making eye contact. "You," she said, pointing one gauntleted finger. "Move." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even particularly aggressive. It was simply the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. And every instinct Marcus possessed told him to slide off that stool, mumble an apology, and disappear into the crowd. Instead, something in him snapped. 3 years of swallowed words. 3 years of watching scholars like him get passed over, pushed aside, and talked over by people who simply took up more physical space in the world. 3 years of the system working exactly as designed, against him. "I was here first," Marcus said. Quietly, clearly, like a man who had already accepted the consequences. The entire tavern went still. What followed wasn't a brawl. Marcus was too smart for that, and Cora, as it turned out, was too experienced. What unfolded was something far more dangerous. A war of positioning, reputation, and principle fought across a single square of wooden floor. Marcus deployed every tool available to him. Tavern law, guild charter rights, the specific wording of the city's public accommodation statutes that he had, in fact, helped draft 2 years prior. Cora deployed something equally powerful: patience, and the slow realization that she was watching someone refuse to break. The crowd shifted. Allegiances moved the way they always do when the underdog refuses the script written for them. By the end of the night, both of them were seated. Neither had surrendered, and a conversation that began as a confrontation had turned into something neither expected. A grudging, complicated, surprisingly honest accounting of what it cost to exist in a world not built for you. Marcus hadn't wanted a friend, he'd wanted his seat. But sometimes standing your ground changes the shape of the ground itself. The trick was never about being unseen. Anyone could be unseen. The world was full of invisible people, and most of them hadn't chosen it. The trick was about being unremarkable, about occupying space so quietly that the space itself forgot to notice. Marcus had spent 3 years refining the technique. Corner stool, back to the wall. Cup 3/4 full at all times. Never empty, because empty invited the question of another round, and questions invited conversation, and conversation invited visibility. Never full, because full meant you just arrived, and arrival meant you were still in the process of becoming part of the room rather than already dissolved into it. 3/4. Always 3/4. He'd measured. The Broken Flagon was not the worst tavern in the Thornwall district. That distinction belonged to a place called the Sow's Ear, which Marcus had visited exactly once. Long enough to watch a half-giant break a table over a disagreement about the weather. The Flagon was merely the most indifferent tavern in the Thornwall district, which made it perfect. Nobody came here to be seen. Nobody came here to make friends. People came to the Broken Flagon because it served watered ale at a price that didn't require selling a kidney, and because Aldrich, the barkeep, had a policy of not remembering anyone's name. Marcus respected that policy deeply. He came every evening at the same hour, 7th bell, when the after-work crowd had already claimed and abandoned the good seats, and the late-night crowd hadn't yet arrived to claim them again. The corner stool would be open. It was always open. Nobody wanted the corner stool. It sat at the junction of two walls, where the draught from the kitchen met the draught from the door in a perpetual cross breeze that smelled of old grease and older wood. The seat was cracked. One leg was a quarter-inch shorter than the others, producing a faint wobble that most people found maddening. Marcus had shimmied it with a folded piece of parchment on his second night. He'd been sitting on that shim for 34 months. He was a scholar. Not the impressive kind. Not the kind with robes and titles and seats on the advisory council, though he'd done contract work for the council twice, drafting language for municipal codes that nobody would ever read until they needed to argue about them. He was the other kind of scholar, the kind who worked out of a rented room above a cobbler's shop, surrounded by books he couldn't technically afford, and notes for papers that no journal had expressed interest in publishing. The kind who understood systems, legal systems, social systems, the invisible architecture of who got to do what and where and why, with a precision that was, in practical terms, almost entirely useless. Almost. He knew, for example, that his corner stool was legally his for as long as he continued to purchase beverages at reasonable intervals per Section 14 of the Thornwall District Public House Code, which defined reasonable as no less than one purchase per hour during peak service and one per 90 minutes during off-peak. He knew that Aldrich's liquor license required him to serve any patron regardless of race, guild affiliation, or academic credentials, per the city's public accommodation statutes. Statutes Marcus had personally helped revise during a 3-month contract that paid just enough to cover 4 months of rent if he ate sparingly. He knew these things the way other people knew how to throw a punch. They were his tools, his armor, his way of existing in a city that had been built, in every meaningful sense, by and for people who were not him. Corner stool, quiet drink, eyes down, 3 years without a single incident. 3 years without being bothered, challenged, threatened, or even particularly noticed. The system worked. He had built it carefully, tested it nightly, and trusted it completely, which, as it turned out, was his first mistake. Because systems only work until someone walks through the door who doesn't know the rules. Or worse, who knows them and simply doesn't care. 7th bell was ringing when Marcus heard the hinges groan. The corner stool was a masterwork of strategic thinking, and Marcus was not too humble to admit it. He'd spent his first 4 months at the broken flagon testing positions the way a siege engineer tests walls. The bar's long edge offered proximity to drinks, but exposed your back to the room. The tables near the hearth were warm but social. People talked to you there, invited themselves into your evening, asked what you were reading, and then didn't listen to the answer. The booths along the far wall seemed promising until he realized they sat directly beneath the stairs to the rooms for let, which meant foot traffic, which meant drunken mercenaries stepping on your satchel at unpredictable intervals. But the corner stool was perfect. It sat where the bar met the wall at an angle that shouldn't have worked architecturally but did, creating a pocket of space that was technically public but functionally private. Your back was protected on 2 sides. You could see the door, the bar, and the main floor without turning your head more than 40 degrees. The barkeep could reach you with a refill. Nobody could reach you with conversation unless they committed to it. And commitment, Marcus had learned, was the one thing most people in the flagon were unwilling to offer anything but their cups. He'd claimed it on a slow Wednesday evening 18 months ago, and had returned to it with such religious consistency that even Aldrich, who forgot the names of regulars he'd served for a decade, had started calling it the Scholar's Perch. Marcus didn't love the name, but he loved that it implied ownership. Tonight he'd arrived at his usual time, an hour past sundown, early enough to beat the shift change crowd from the garrison, but late enough that the afternoon drinkers had already stumbled home or passed out in the booths. He'd ordered his usual, a half pint of the brown ale, not because he particularly enjoyed it, but because it was the cheapest thing that came in a vessel small enough to last exactly the right amount of time. 2 hours. That was the window. Long enough to decompress from the day's work at the codifier's hall, short enough to get home before the streets turned genuinely dangerous. He had his book open on the bar. Aldrich had long since stopped telling him to keep it off the wood, and was making his way through Castellan's treatise on municipal obligation, which was as dry as it sounded and twice as important. The city council session was in 6 days. There were 3 proposed amendments to the public accommodation statutes that Marcus had helped draft, and 2 of them had been so thoroughly butchered in committee that he barely recognized his own reasoning. This was what scholars did, not the dramatic kind of scholarship that Bard sang about, the lone wizard in his tower, the sage deciphering the prophecy just in time. Marcus's scholarship was the kind that happened in margins. Literal margins. He wrote in them constantly, cramped notations in an ink he mixed himself because the commercial varieties smudged too easily on bureaucratic grade parchment. He was writing in one such margin now, annotating a clause about the rights of patrons in licensed establishments, when the door opened and the temperature of the room changed. Not literally. The hearth was on the far side and the draught from the door barely reached the corner. But something shifted in the noise. The particular quality of 24 conversations adjusting simultaneously. The way a flock of birds changes direction without any single bird deciding to turn. Marcus didn't look up. That was part of the system too. You didn't look at what came through the door because looking was engaging, and engaging was the first step toward being engaged with, and being engaged with was the first step toward trouble. He kept his eyes on Castellan's prose. He turned a page. He lifted his half-pint and found it empty, which meant he'd been here longer than he'd thought. He raised a finger for Aldrich, and that was his hand in the air, one finger up, face still angled toward the book, when the heavy footsteps stopped directly behind him. The door didn't open so much as yield. Marcus registered the change in air pressure before he registered the shape. A draft that shouldn't have existed. The broken flagon's front door was heavy oak reinforced with iron banding, designed to keep weather and trouble on the same side. Rolled across the room like something breathing. Candle flames near the entrance bent sideways. The fire in the hearth coughed. Then the door frame filled. And kept filling. And Marcus understood that the weather and the trouble had found a way in after all. She had to duck. That was the first thing he noticed, because the flagon's doorway was built for human proportions and she was not built for human anything. Her helm caught the lintel, a dull scrape of metal on stone, and she tilted her head with the practiced ease of someone who had been ducking through doorways, built too small for her entire life. 7 feet of green. Not the storybook green of children's tales. The lurid emerald that illustrated bestiaries, painted onto orcs to make them look like something that crawled out of a swamp. Her skin was the color of deep jade where it caught the firelight, darker along the jaw and across the bridge of a nose that had been broken at least twice and reset by someone who cared more about function than aesthetics. Her tusks were short by orc standards, filed, Marcus noted, which meant military, and capped in brass that caught the light when she exhaled. The armor told a story. Campaign plate, once regulation black but now weathered to a mottled charcoal, dented across the left pauldron where something heavy had hit hard enough to reshape the metal around the dent rather than through it. Her unit insignia was stitched into a tabard so stained with road dust and old weather that the colors had given up trying to be colors. But Marcus could still make out the shape. 8th Forward, the garrison unit that patrolled the northern trade roads. He knew them by reputation. Everyone in the city did. They walked the routes that caravans feared and bandits respected, and they did it in 16-hour shifts because the 8th was perpetually understaffed, and the city council perpetually uninterested in funding the things that kept them alive. She carried her helm under one arm after clearing the doorway. Her hair was cropped close to the skull, regulation again, and there was a scar that started above her left ear and disappeared into the hairline, pale against the green, like a river on a map to somewhere painful. Her eyes swept the room the way a sergeant's eyes sweep anything. Threat assessment first, comfort second, everything ranked and catalogued in the space between one breath and the next. The tavern didn't go quiet. Not yet. But it reorganized. Conversations shifted pitch. Bodies adjusted angles. The unconscious mathematics of shared space recalculated around a new variable that weighed more and took up more room than any three of the current patrons combined. Two men near the door leaned away from each other to create a lane that nobody had asked for but everybody understood was necessary. She walked to the bar. Her boots were heavy enough to feel through the floorboards. And Marcus could track her progress with his eyes closed if he'd wanted to. He didn't close his eyes. He was watching, the way he watched everything, cataloguing the details because details were what scholars had instead of swords. She reached the bar, scanned the stools, all occupied. Her jaw tightened. It was a small thing. The brass caps on her tusks shifted maybe a quarter inch. But Marcus saw it because Marcus was in the business of seeing small things, and because he was sitting on the corner stool closest to where she was standing, and because in that moment, some suicidal part of his attention decided that this was the thing worth paying attention to, instead of the bottom of his cup. Her eyes finished their sweep. They landed on him. And Marcus, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not being seen, was seen. The door hit the wall before Marcus registered it had opened. Not a kick. Just force applied without consideration for hinges or the general structural integrity of tavern architecture. The kind of entrance that suggested the person entering had spent most of their life walking through things that failed to move quickly enough. Cold air rolled in, then the smell, campaign leather, weapon oil, and something metallic that Marcus's hindbrain identified as old blood before his conscious mind could file it under. Not my problem. He looked up. That was the mistake. Not the looking. Looking was instinct, animal response, the same twitch that made rabbits freeze when a shadow crossed the grass. The mistake was what happened after. The half-second delay, the failure to immediately drop his gaze back to his cup. The infinitesimal pause during which his eyes met hers and his brain, that traitorous engine of pattern recognition, decided to process what it was seeing. 7 feet, green, armored, orc. Sergeant's insignia on the pauldron, 3 campaign marks scored into the leather below it, and a face that looked like it had been designed by a god who valued function over aesthetics and then field-tested in conditions that voided the warranty. She was scanning the room the way soldiers scan rooms, not looking for friends, not looking for the bar, but identifying exits, threats, and load-bearing walls in that order. Her eyes swept left to right, passed over clusters of drinkers, the standing room crowd near the hearth, the packed tables where elbows fought for sovereignty over shared wood. Every stool occupied, every bench full. Her scan reached the corner, reached Marcus, and stopped. He knew, in the space between her gaze landing on him and her mouth opening, exactly what was about to happen. The same way you know, watching a cup tip at the edge of a table, that gravity is about to make its argument. There was still time, a quarter second, maybe less, in which the correct response was available to him. Drop eyes, hunch shoulders, become furniture. The system, the protocol. 3 years of flawless operational invisibility, and all he had to do was execute the same maneuver he'd executed 1,000 times before. His eyes stayed up. Later, he would try to reconstruct why. He would lie in his narrow bed in his narrow room and replay the moment with the obsessive precision of a scholar annotating a catastrophic text. And he would fail every time to locate the exact mechanism of his own betrayal. It wasn't courage. He was reasonably certain of that. It wasn't defiance, or pride, or any of the noble architectures that people built around their worst decisions after the fact. It might have been exhaustion. 3 years is a long time to maintain a protocol. The muscles involved in making yourself small, not just the physical ones, but the ones that lived somewhere behind the sternum. The ones that clenched every time you chose absence over presence. Those muscles get tired too. And tired muscles fail at the worst possible moments. Or it might have been simpler than that. It might have been that his beer was at the perfect temperature for the first time in 3 years, and some suicidally honest part of him decided that this one small pleasure was a hill worth dying on. Whatever the reason, his eyes were up when Cora's gaze found him. Up and, God help him, steady. Not challenging, not aggressive, just present. Visibly, undeniably, catastrophically present. She registered it. He saw her register it. The slight narrowing, the recalculation, the way her trajectory adjusted by 2 degrees to center on his specific location in the room. She started walking toward him. Each step covered roughly the distance Marcus could have used to escape if he'd started moving at any point in the previous 3 seconds. He hadn't. He was still sitting on his corner stool, hands around his perfect beer, watching his own destruction approach at a leisurely pace. "You," she said. One word, one gauntleted finger, extended. "Move!" The word no had been sitting in Marcus's throat for 3 years. Not just sitting, composting, fermenting, building pressure the way cheap ale builds gas in a sealed cask. Quietly, invisibly, until something gives. He could trace it back to a specific afternoon. His second week in Thornwall, before he'd discovered the broken flagon, before he'd perfected the corner stool system. He'd been standing in the queue at the clerk's office, waiting to file his guild certification papers. 2 hours in line, feet aching, nearly at the window. A dwarf merchant had simply walked past him to the counter. Not aggressively, not even rudely exactly, just as though Marcus were a piece of furniture that happened to be in the way. And Marcus had let it happen. He'd stepped aside, and he'd waited another 40 minutes. And he'd said nothing. That was the first swallowed word. The others came faster after that. The faculty meeting where Professor Aldrich talked over his proposal about updating the city's property statutes, then presented the same idea 3 weeks later as his own. Marcus had opened his mouth, closed it. Opened it again, closed it. Written a very detailed letter of objection that he never sent. The landlord who raised his rent by 30% because, as she explained with cheerful directness, scholars didn't complain. They understood numbers. They knew the market rate. They paid or they left, and either way, they did it quietly. Marcus had paid. The guard at the library gate who checked his credentials every single morning for 9 consecutive months, despite knowing his name, despite Marcus having helped catalogue the restricted collection, despite the head librarian herself posting a notice that Marcus Chen Oldworth was to be admitted without delay. Every morning, "Papers, please." And every morning, Marcus produced them, smiled politely, said thank you. The city council session where he'd spent 4 months drafting the public accommodation statutes. Careful, precise language about equal access to taverns, inns, and public houses. Language designed to protect exactly the kind of person he was. And then sat silently, while Councilwoman Vex took credit for the framework during the public reading. He'd watched from the gallery. He'd applauded with everyone else. Each incident was small. Each one was survivable. Each one was perfectly reasonable if you looked at it from the right angle, tilted your head, and convinced yourself that making a fuss would cost more than staying quiet. And each one left a residue. 3 years of residue doesn't wash off. It calcifies. It becomes part of the skeleton. Marcus had built his invisibility system on a foundation of swallowed words. And the system worked. And the system was killing him so slowly that he'd mistaken the dying for living. He knew what he was supposed to do when Cora pointed at him. The script was tattooed on his nervous system. Stand up, step aside, smile, disappear, go home. Write a detailed journal entry about the interaction. Feel nothing. Sleep. Repeat. But something about this particular moment, This specific convergence of packed tavern and pointed finger, and the flat commanding certainty that he would move because he had always moved, cracked the cask. Maybe it was the ale. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that he'd spent that afternoon rereading his own public accommodation statutes and noticing, for the first time, that he'd written protections for everyone in Thornwall except himself. He'd carved out rights for orcs, dwarves, elves, halflings, every species and guild class and military rank. Nowhere in those carefully drafted pages had he written the words, "Scholars may not be displaced from seats they lawfully occupy." An oversight. A telling one. "I was here first," Marcus said. 4 words. Barely above speaking volume. Delivered with the calm of a man who has just heard something shatter inside himself and is curious, genuinely, academically curious, about what happens next. The residue of 3 years crystallized into a spine. The silence had a texture. Marcus had experienced quiet taverns before. The lull between songs, the held breath before a fight, the respectful hush when someone important walked through the door. Those silences were temporary. They were pauses in the natural rhythm of noise, and everyone understood them as such. They had edges you could feel, boundaries that told you when the world would resume its normal volume. This was different. This silence was watching him. 40-some people in the broken flagon, and every single one of them had stopped whatever they were doing to see what happened next. Conversations died mid-syllable. A barmaid holding 3 mugs of ale stood frozen between tables, the foam settling in real time. Somewhere near the fireplace, a man had been laughing, the sound cut off so abruptly that Marcus could still hear the ghost of it hanging in the air like smoke. He was aware of his own breathing. He was aware of the grain of the bar beneath his fingertips. He was aware that his heart was doing something genuinely alarming in his chest, a percussion that seemed audible in the stillness, though surely it couldn't be. Cora hadn't moved. That was the worst part. She still stood with that gauntleted finger extended, close enough that Marcus could see the scratches in the metal, the dull patina of iron that had been repaired more than once. Her expression hadn't shifted from that initial flash of surprise. She was processing, recalculating, and Marcus understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the next few seconds would determine everything. Not just whether he kept his seat, but what kind of person he was going to be when he walked out of this tavern, if he walked out of this tavern. He kept his hands flat on the bar, open, visible, not a threat. He wasn't stupid enough to make a fist, and he wasn't theatrical enough to cross his arms. The positioning was deliberate. I am here. I am not moving, and I am not challenging you to violence. It was the posture of a man holding ground, not claiming territory. The distinction mattered. Gods, the distinction mattered. Around them, the crowd was performing its own calculations. Marcus could feel the mathematics happening, the subtle algebra of social risk, the equations that determined who you backed and who you abandoned. Most of these people knew him, at least by sight. Corner stool Marcus, quiet Marcus. The one who nursed his ale and read his documents and never caused a moment's trouble for anyone. He was furniture, he was scenery, he was the kind of person you forgot was in the room until you needed the seat he was sitting in. And most of them knew Cora, or at least knew what she represented. The patrol sergeant's insignia on her pauldron, the campaign ribbons, the fact that she could, with no particular effort, pick Marcus up and physically relocate him to any spot in the tavern she chose. The power differential wasn't subtle. It was 7 feet of biographical argument against his 5'8" frame. But there was a third factor in the equation, one that the crowd was only now beginning to weigh. He'd said it so quietly. I was here first, not shouted, not snarled, not delivered with the false bravado of someone trying to convince themselves they were brave. He'd said it the way you'd state the time of day or the weather, or any other fact that existed independent of anyone's feelings about it. A simple observation. The sky is blue, water is wet. I was here first. There was no arguing with the fact of it. There was only the question of whether facts mattered in this particular room, on this particular night, when one person had principles and the other had mass. The barmaid set down the 3 mugs. The sound was enormous, ceramic meeting wood in a small, sharp report that made half the room flinch. Cora lowered her finger. She didn't lower her gaze. "You want to do this?" she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus kept his hands flat on the bar. "I'm just sitting here." The stillness tightened. The silence had weight. Marcus could feel it pressing against his eardrums, thick and expectant. The silence of 30-odd people who had collectively decided that whatever happened next was more interesting than their drinks. He used it. "Tavern law," he said, and his voice carried further than he intended. He adjusted, brought it down to something conversational, something reasonable. Reasonable was the weapon here. Section 14 of the Municipal Charter governing licensed public houses. A patron in lawful occupation of a seat retains right of tenancy for the duration of their custom, provided they maintain active purchase and commit no breach of house peace. He watched the words land. Not on Cora. She hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. Still stood with that gauntleted hand half raised in its interrupted point, but on the crowd. The bartender. The regulars who came here 5 nights a week and had never once considered that the stool beneath them was anything other than wood and nails. It was a foundation. It was jurisdiction. "I have an active drink," Marcus continued, tilting his half-finished ale so the lamplight caught it. "I have committed no breach of peace. I am in lawful occupation." Someone at a table near the hearth let out a low whistle. Marcus ignored it. He kept his eyes on Cora's chin. Not her eyes, not yet, that would be challenge. And not the floor, never the floor again. But the chin, neutral ground, a scholar's trick for appearing engaged without appearing aggressive. Cora's hand lowered, slowly. The gauntlet settled against her hip with a sound like a lockbox closing. "Tavern law," she repeated. Not mocking exactly, testing the shape of it in her mouth. "You're citing municipal code. At me. In a bar." "I helped draft the public accommodation statutes 2 years ago," Marcus said. And he hadn't meant to say that, but the words were out and they were true, and truth, once spoken, was its own kind of armor. Sections 14 through 22, the language on tenancy rights was mine. I wrote it specifically because... He stopped. Because the next words were because people like you push people like me off seats they're sitting in. And that was true too, but it was a different kind of true. The kind that started fights instead of finishing them. "Because it needed writing," he said instead. The bartender, a thick man named Harlow, whose diplomatic instincts had been honed by decades of standing between drunk people and sharp objects, cleared his throat. "He's not wrong, Sergeant. I mean, I don't know the section numbers. But there's custom. You don't tip a man off his stool." "I wasn't going to tip him," Cora said, and there was something in her voice that Marcus hadn't expected. Not anger, irritation certainly, but underneath it, the careful modulation of someone who understood that her voice, her size, her armor could turn a conversation into an incident without her permission. She was managing herself. He recognized it because he'd spent 3 years doing the same thing. "I asked him to move." "You told me to move," Marcus corrected, quietly, precisely. The scholar's vice, accuracy at all costs. Cora's jaw worked. The tusks, short, well-maintained, one slightly chipped near the base, caught the firelight as her mouth tightened. "Fine," she said. "I told you to move." "And I declined." "And you declined." She said the word like she was examining a beetle she'd found in her rations. Curiosity mixed with faint revulsion. The crowd had shifted its weight collectively, the way spectators do when they realize the match is going to be longer and stranger than they anticipated. Cups were lifted. Elbows settled on tables. The broken flagon had become a courtroom and an arena simultaneously, and Marcus was standing, sitting, technically, which was the entire point, at the center of both. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. But his voice held. That was enough. For now, that was everything. Cora had been tired before. She'd been tired after the siege of Valmir, where she'd held a breach in a crumbling wall for 11 hours, while arrows fell like sleet. She'd been tired after the forced march across the Thornfeld Basin, 90 miles in 3 days with full kit, half rations, and a commanding officer who died on day 2, leaving her to keep 43 soldiers moving through mud that sucked at their boots like something hungry. She'd been tired in ways that went past the body and into the architecture of the self, fatigue so profound it became a kind of philosophy. You didn't fight it. You inhabited it. You let the weight settle into your bones and became the thing that carried it. This was a different kind of tired. She was standing in a tavern, watching a man half her size refuse to move, and something in the back of her skull was quietly recalibrating everything she'd assumed about the next 30 seconds. He wasn't grandstanding. That was the thing. She'd seen grandstanding, soldiers puffing their chests before a superior, drunk farmers squaring up outside festival tents, politicians finding their spines only when the crowd was watching. Grandstanding had a particular energy, a vibration in the voice, a need to be witnessed in the act of defiance. Marcus wasn't performing. He was simply sitting. His hands were steady around his cup. His breathing was even. His eyes, behind those scholarly spectacles, held the flat calm of someone who had already run the calculation to its conclusion and found the answer acceptable. She'd seen that look exactly once before, on the face of a sapper outside Creighton, who told her, very politely, that the bridge was going to blow whether she was on it or not, and that he'd appreciate it if she'd stepped to the other side. She'd stepped. Not because he'd frightened her, because she'd recognized competence. The crowd was still holding its breath. She could feel them. All those human and half-human and carefully neutral faces, waiting for the orc to do what orcs did. Waiting for the flash of temper, the upended table, the satisfying crash that would confirm every story they'd ever told themselves about her kind. And that was the second weight she carried. Not just her own exhaustion, but the exhaustion of being a symbol before she was ever allowed to be a person. Every room she entered ran the same silent arithmetic. How angry was the orc? How close to violence? How many exits were available? She'd learned to read it the way Marcus had apparently learned to read statute law, fluently, automatically, with the grim efficiency of someone for whom misreading meant consequences. She could take the stool. She was physically capable of lifting Marcus off it with one hand and setting him on the floor like a wayward cat. It would be easy, it would be quick, and it would cost her something she'd spent 16 years of military service earning, the right to be seen as more than the sum of her tusks. So instead of reaching for him, she let the silence stretch. Patience was a weapon most people underestimated. They thought it was passive, a kind of surrender. They were wrong. Real patience was active. It was the decision to hold position when every nerve screamed advance. It was the discipline of the watchtower, not the charge. She'd learned patience from a human captain as it happened. A small, quiet woman named Dressler, who'd commanded Cora's first company, and who'd once held a negotiation with a warlord for 9 hours without raising her voice, without blinking, without giving a single inch of ground until the terms were right. Dressler had told her, "The person who moves first has already told you what they're afraid of." Cora wasn't afraid of a scholar on a bar stool, but she was beginning to be genuinely curious about one. She shifted her weight, let her armor settle, and did something that made 3 people at the nearest table visibly flinch. She crossed her arms and waited. Marcus reached into his satchel. The gesture drew a sharp intake of breath from several patrons nearby, which told him everything he needed to know about how the crowd perceived the power dynamics at play. They thought he was reaching for a weapon against a 7-foot orc warrior in full campaign armor. The idea would have been laughable if it weren't so deeply sad. What he produced was paper, specifically a folded sheaf of parchment that had been sitting in the bottom of his bag for 8 months, pressed flat beneath 3 volumes of administrative commentary and a tin of cheap ink. He hadn't planned to need it tonight. He hadn't planned to need it ever, really. He carried it the way some people carried lucky coins. Not because they believed in luck, but because the alternative was believing in nothing at all. Tavern law gives me standing, he said, unfolding the document on the bar top with the careful precision of someone who understood that presentation was half the argument. But this gives me specifics. Cora's eyes tracked the movement of his hands. She didn't speak. The City of Ashenmere's Public Accommodation Statutes, revised 18 months ago by the Council of Letters. He smoothed the crease with his thumb. Section 14, subsection 3. All establishments holding a common house license shall provide seating and service to patrons on a first-arrival basis, without regard to guild rank, military station, species, or physical stature. He paused, letting the words settle into the room like stones dropped into still water. Without regard to physical stature, he repeated. That language was argued over for 6 hours in committee. I know because I drafted it. Something changed in Cora's expression. It was subtle, a fractional narrowing of the eyes, a slight tilt of the head that shifted her from annoyed soldier dealing with an obstacle to tactician reassessing the terrain. Marcus had seen that look before, on the faces of council members who'd walked into hearings expecting a formality and discovered they were in a fight. You wrote that, she said. Not a question. I wrote 17 of the 42 sections, the ones dealing with common house licensing, seating priority, and the rights of non-guild affiliated citizens to occupy public spaces. He kept his voice level, academic, as if he were presenting to a review board rather than facing down someone who could fold him in half without significantly exerting herself. The statute carries the weight of city charter. Enforcement is binding on all license holders. He looked at Brennan, who had developed a sudden and consuming interest in polishing the same glass he'd been polishing for the last 5 minutes. Brennan, you renewed your common house license in spring, yes? The barkeep's polishing intensified. Aye, he managed. Then you're bound by Section 14, which means this stool is mine until I choose to vacate it. And no one, not a soldier, not a guild master, not the Lord Warden himself, can compel me to move. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence that had preceded it. The first silence had been the held breath of spectators watching someone walk off a cliff. This silence was the held breath of spectators realizing the cliff might not be where they thought it was. Cora stood perfectly still. The lamplight caught the fresh mud on her greaves, the tarnished campaign medallions on her chest, the deep fatigue lines carved around her tusks. She looked at the document on the bar. She looked at Marcus. Then, she did something that surprised everyone in the room. Marcus most of all. She laughed. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. It was the short, rough bark of someone who had just been outflanked on ground she hadn't realized she was contesting, and who possessed enough self-awareness to recognize the maneuver for what it was. You drafted the law, she said, that protects your seat. I drafted the law that protects everyone's seat, Marcus corrected quietly. I just happened to be sitting in one. The crowd had a story it wanted to tell. Marcus could feel it taking shape the way he'd felt arguments crystallize in committee rooms. That invisible consensus, that gravitational pull toward a narrative everyone could agree on. The plucky little scholar who stood up to the big scary orc, David and Goliath with tankards. He hated it. Don't, he said, loud enough that the nearest tables heard him. A dockworker named Fenn had been grinning in his direction. raising a mug in what was clearly meant to be solidarity. The grin faltered. "Don't what?" "Don't make me your story." Because he knew how that story ended. The crowd would champion him tonight, buy him drinks, clap him on the back. And tomorrow, they go right back to ignoring every scholar who got shouldered out of line at the grain exchange, every clerk who got talked over in guild meetings, every person who existed below a certain threshold of physical significance. They'd have their moment of feeling righteous without changing a single thing that made the moment necessary. He'd watched it happen in the assembly. Someone would give an impassioned speech about laborers' rights, and the delegates would applaud, and then they'd table the resolution for another quarter. The performance of caring substituted for the act. Cora was watching him again. She'd been doing that, really watching, the way she watched terrain before committing troops. And something had shifted in the quality of her attention. It wasn't amusement anymore. It wasn't even the grudging respect of the last few minutes. It was recognition. "You're not just fighting me," she said. "I was never fighting you." That landed differently than he'd expected. Her jaw worked, and she looked away. Not in dismissal, but in the manner of someone reassessing a position they'd held for so long it had become load-bearing. "Then what are you doing?" Marcus considered the question honestly. The anger that had kept him on the stool had burned through its initial fuel and was running on something steadier now, something architectural. Not rage, principle. The difference mattered. "I'm sitting in a chair I arrived at first, in a public house governed by statutes I helped write, and I'm declining to pretend that the size of my body determines my right to be here." He paused. "That's all. That's the entire thing. That's not small. No. But it's not a story about you being the villain either." The silence between them was different this time. Not the held-breath silence of a crowd waiting for violence, but the working silence of two people processing the same information at different speeds, from different directions, toward what might turn out to be the same conclusion. Fenn, the dock worker, had lowered his mug. 2 tables over, a woman Marcus recognized as a weaver from the textile quarter was frowning. Not in disapproval, but in the uncomfortable way people frowned when they realized they'd been cast in a story without consenting to it either. The whole room was recalibrating. Good. Let them be uncomfortable. Comfort was the enemy of every decent statute he'd ever helped draft. Comfort was the voice in every committee meeting that said, "Let's not rush things and perhaps we should study the matter further. And I'm sure it will sort itself out." ***. 3 years of corner stool invisibility had been comfortable. It had also been a slow, methodical erasure. Marcus looked at Cora. She looked back, and for the first time he saw her not as an obstacle or a symbol or a representative of every person who'd ever made him feel small. He saw a tired soldier at the end of a long shift who wanted somewhere to sit, operating under a set of assumptions the world had rewarded her for holding. That didn't make those assumptions right, but it made them explicable. "I'm not moving," he said. "I heard you the first time," she said. "Then we should probably figure out what comes next." Cora's expression did something complicated. It was almost, if you knew what to look for, the beginning of agreement. The thing about a crowd is that it doesn't decide anything. Not really. A crowd is just a collection of individual cowardices, each one waiting to see which way the others lean before committing to a direction. Marcus had watched this phenomenon for 3 years from his corner stool. He'd seen bar fights decided not by who threw the best punch, but by whose friends stood up first. He'd seen arguments won by volume, by confidence, by the simple willingness to keep talking after the other person ran out of breath. He'd never been on the receiving end of the shift before. It started with the dock worker. "He's got a point about the charter," the man said to no one in particular, staring into his ale as though the observation had simply fallen out of him by accident. "My cousin filed under the same section when the merchant quarter tried to restrict his stall placement." That was all, one sentence. But it landed in the silence like a stone in still water. Cora's eyes moved to the dock worker. He didn't look up. Smart man. Then the woman 2 tables back. Marcus recognized her vaguely, a clerk from the Registry of Deeds, cleared her throat. The public accommodation statutes are actually quite clear on this. First occupancy establishes priority of claim regardless of… She paused, seeming to realize she was speaking out loud. Regardless of station or service record. "Nobody asked you," said someone near the bar, one of the regulars. Marcus didn't know his name, but knew his type. The kind of man who sided with whoever seemed most likely to win. "Nobody asked him to move either," the clerk replied. "She told him." That distinction landed. Marcus could feel it settle over the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. There was a difference between asking and telling, and everyone in the Broken Flagon had been on the wrong end of that difference at least once. Cora stood very still. Marcus watched her process the shift with the tactical awareness of someone who had read battlefields for a living. She was not stupid, she had never been stupid, and she could see the terrain changing under her feet as clearly as he could. "This isn't a courthouse," she said. "Measured, controlled." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's a tavern, where I'm sitting on my stool." A sound rippled through the room. Not quite laughter, something more dangerous. Recognition. The small, involuntary noise people make when they see their own smallness reflected back at them and find it, for once, standing upright. The barkeep, Holt, who had been methodically polishing the same glass for the last 10 minutes, set it down with a decisive click. "Sergeant Cora, I respect your service. Everyone here does." He let that sit. "Man's got his seat. That's how it works." It wasn't brave. Holt was reading the room the same way he read it every night, calculating the path of least breakage. But it was public, and in a crowd, public declarations have a weight that private sympathies never will. Marcus felt something unfamiliar in his chest. It took him a moment to identify it, because he'd gone so long without experiencing it in this context. Solidarity. Not the comfortable kind. Not the kind built on shared interests or mutual affection. The uncomfortable, provisional kind. The kind that exists only because a room full of people who have all been told to move, recognized, in a single moment of collective clarity, that maybe they didn't have to. It wouldn't last. Marcus knew that. Tomorrow the dock worker would step aside for the next person who outweighed him. The clerk would file her documents and keep her head down. Holt would serve whoever paid. But right now, in this moment, the ground had shifted. Cora looked at Marcus. He looked back, and for the first time since she'd walked through that door, something changed in her expression. Not defeat, not anger, reassessment. The stool question resolved itself the way most impossible problems do, through someone else's cowardice. A merchant 3 seats down, who had been watching the standoff with increasingly panicked eyes, suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. He slid off his stool with a muttered excuse about an early shipment, dropped 2 coppers on the bar, and fled into the night without meeting anyone's gaze. The stool sat empty, steaming faintly, where his nervous body heat had warmed the wood. Neither Marcus nor Cora moved toward it. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. Not tense, not electric. Evaluative. The kind of quiet that settles over a chessboard when both players realize the endgame has arrived and neither is certain who holds advantage. "That's a seat," Pella observed from behind the bar, her tone carefully neutral. "It is," Marcus agreed. Cora's jaw worked once, twice. The muscles in her neck, thick as Marcus's thigh, corded and released. "I'm not taking the mercy stool," she said. Marcus blinked. "The what?" "When someone vacates because they can't stand the weather. That's a mercy stool. You take it, you're admitting you needed rescue." She shook her head, a single sharp motion. "I've held positions for 9 hours in freezing rain waiting for relief that command forgot to send. I don't need rescue from a seating arrangement. Then we have a problem, Marcus said, because I'm not taking it either. You could. No one would think less of you. You made your point. You think this was about making a point? The question landed harder than he'd intended. Cora's eyes, massy amber catching the lamplight like polished stones, narrowed slightly. Not in anger, in reassessment. Wasn't it? She asked. Marcus considered lying, considered the diplomatic answer, the graceful exit, the scholarly retreat into abstraction. He was good at those. Good. 3 years of practice. No, he said instead. It was about the seat. Somewhere in the back of the tavern, someone coughed. The fire popped. Pella wiped down a glass she'd already cleaned twice. Cora looked at the empty stool, looked at Marcus's corner stool, looked at Marcus. Scoot over, she said. What? Your corner. There's wall space to your left. Stool fits if you shift 6 inches east. She was already moving, lifting the abandoned merchant stool with one hand, the same way someone might lift a teacup, and carrying it toward the corner. I'm not sitting in the middle of the room with my back exposed, and you're not leaving your position, so we share the corner. That's not, Marcus started, then stopped, because she was right. The geometry worked, barely. His stool against the wall, hers wedged at an angle that gave them both partial corner protection. It would be tight. Their elbows might touch, but neither of them would have moved. He shifted 6 inches east, so she set the stool down, the leg scraping against the floorboards, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she sat, the stool groaned, the corner creaked, Marcus's shoulder pressed against cold stone on one side and warm armor on the other. This is deeply uncomfortable, he said. Most victories are. Is that what this is? A victory? Cora settled her weight, the stool finding its equilibrium beneath her. She set her gauntlets on the bar with the careful precision of someone disarming. I have a seat. You have your seat. The law held. The chain of command held. A pause. I'd call that operational success with suboptimal comfort margins. Marcus felt something unfamiliar moving through his chest. It took him a moment to identify it, because it had been a long time. It was the feeling of not having lost. Not winning, exactly. Something stranger and more durable than winning. The feeling of a line drawn and held, and finding that the person on the other side of the line had drawn one too, and that the two lines, against all probability, had found a way to coexist. Pella appeared before them, 2 mugs already in hand. On the house, she said, for the entertainment. The second round arrived without either of them ordering it. Bren set the drinks down with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that whatever was happening at his bar had moved beyond his jurisdiction. He retreated. The crowd had thinned by now, the spectacle over, the late-hour drinkers filtering toward the door or settling into their own quieter negotiations with the night. What remained was a half-empty tavern, 2 occupied stools, and a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable and started being something else entirely. Cora drank, set the cup down, studied the ring it left on the wood. You know what they don't tell you about bleeding for a city, she said. They don't tell you that the city doesn't remember. 4 front lines. The Ashfell campaign alone cost me 11 soldiers from my unit. I carried 2 of them back with my bare hands. You know what I got when I came home? Marcus waited. A pension dispute. 3 months of forms. A clerk who couldn't spell my rank correctly and didn't care to learn. She turned the cup slowly. I exist in their records as Sergeant Cora, 1R, as though the second one was too much trouble. Marcus looked at his own drink. The ale had gone warm. He didn't mind. I helped draft the public accommodation statutes, he said. Spent 8 months on the language. Every clause, every exception, every careful piece of wording designed to ensure that any citizen, human, orc, dwarf, any of them, could occupy public space without being displaced by force or social pressure. He paused. The Guild Council adopted the statutes and struck my name from the authorship. Attributed the work to Alderman Voss, who contributed nothing beyond his signature. Cora looked at him. I didn't fight it, Marcus continued. That's the part I think about. I had standing. I had documentation. I could have invoked the very protections I'd written, but I calculated the cost, the way I always calculate the cost, and I decided that invisibility was cheaper than justice. The word sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Until tonight, Cora said. Until tonight. She leaned back and her armor groaned with the motion, a sound so familiar to her that she didn't register it, though Marcus had flinched at it hours ago and no longer did now. I walked through that door expecting the world to work the way it always works, she said. I'm bigger. I'm louder. I served. So I take the seat, and whoever's sitting in it understands. That's the transaction. That's how it goes. She rubbed the back of her neck where the armor met skin and had worn a permanent callus. I didn't even see you as a person. You were an obstacle shaped like a man. I know, Marcus said. Everyone does. And you, she said, with something that was not quite accusation and not quite admiration. You sat there and made me see you. Made me stand there long enough that I had to. Marcus turned this over. It was, he realized, the most accurate description anyone had ever given of what his life required. The world isn't built for either of us, he said. It's built for Alderman Voss and the clerk who misspelled your name. It's built for people who don't have to think about whether they'll be seen. Because the architecture of everything assumes their shape. Cora was quiet for a long moment. So what do we do about it? It was not a rhetorical question. Marcus recognized this because rhetorical questions had a certain hollow music to them, and this had none. This was a soldier identifying a problem and asking for the plan. He didn't have one. He was a scholar on a corner stool who had, for the first time in 3 years, refused to disappear. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Cora picked up her drink, considered it, considered him. Fair enough, she said, and the word fair meant something different now than it had at the start of the evening. But if you figure it out, I know where to find you. She glanced at his stool. Marcus, against every instinct, laughed. The second round arrived without either of them ordering it. Berta set the cups down between them. Ale for Cora, the dark winter mead Marcus favoured, and disappeared back behind the bar without a word. Marcus stared at the cup for a moment, then at Cora, who was already drinking. She's never done that before, he said. Done what? Given me anything I didn't explicitly pay for. Cora set her cup down. The foam left a pale line across her upper lip that she wiped away with the back of her hand. Maybe she's investing in the show. The show's over. Is it? Marcus picked up the mead. It was the good stuff. The kind Berta kept behind the third barrel. The kind that cost twice what he normally spent. He took a sip and let the warmth of it settle into the place beneath his sternum, where the tension had been living for the past hour. You helped write the accommodation statutes, Cora said. Not a question this time. She'd been chewing on it. I was one of 7 scholars on the drafting committee. My contribution was largely procedural language, definitions, scope of applicability. He paused. The boring parts. The parts that hold. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not the calculating assessment from before, not the grudging acknowledgement that had replaced it, but something quieter, something tired. You know what they pay scholars on a municipal drafting committee? He asked. Nothing. 11 silver for the full term. 6 months of work, 11 silver. He turned the cup in his hands. I did it because I genuinely believed, that if the language was precise enough, if the definitions were airtight, then people like me wouldn't have to fight for a seat at a bar. The law would do the fighting. And tonight, Tonight, I learned the law doesn't fight. It just gives you something to hold on to while you fight yourself. Cora was quiet for a long time. Around them, the tavern had resumed its rhythms. Not quite the same as before. Conversations slightly louder on one side of the room where the dockworkers clustered, slightly quieter near the hearth where the old merchants nursed their drinks. The geography of the evening had shifted, and Marcus could feel it like a change in pressure. 4 front lines, Cora said finally. Greymarch, the Saltwood Campaign, Kessler's Folly. They actually called it that while we were still dying in it. And the Thornwall Siege. She counted them off on fingers that bore scars across every knuckle. You want to know what they pay an orc sergeant after 16 years of service? Marcus waited. Enough to drink somewhere nicer than this. She gestured at the broken flagon's stained ceiling, its warped floorboards, the candles that guttered in their cheap iron holders. But the nice places go quiet when I walk in. A different kind of quiet than tonight. Tonight was surprise. There, it's endurance, Marcus said. They're enduring your presence. Yes. So you drink here. So I drink here. Where the worst I get is a full room and no seat. She almost smiled, until some skinny scholar with a death wish decides to teach me municipal law. I don't have a death wish. I have a stool. You have a stool, she agreed. They drank in a silence that had changed composition since the last one. Less the silence of 2 people deciding whether to break each other and more the silence of 2 people recognizing the same bruise from different angles. 11 silver, Cora said, shaking her head. It was supposed to matter. It did matter. Tonight, it mattered. Marcus considered that. He considered the mead he hadn't paid for and the stool beneath him and the woman beside him who could have lifted him off it one-handed and hadn't, not because of any statute or charter or guild provision, but because somewhere in the argument she'd decided not to. What does it cost you? He asked. The patience. All that patience you carry. Cora finished her ale and set the empty cup down with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how much force everything required. Same thing your invisibility costs you, she said. Everything you were supposed to be instead.